Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar. My name is Brayden McNeil. I'm the Technical Sales and Marketing Lead here at Aquanty. We really hope that everyone will enjoy today's webinar and that it'll lead to further partnerships with water resources experts around the world. If there's anything in this project or the software being used for today's webinar that interests you, feel free to connect with us at Aquanty. You can send an email to me directly, or you can email info@aquanty.com, and we'll be sure to put you in touch with the right people to answer your questions. Before we begin the presentation, I'd like to make a very quick land acknowledgement. Aquanty is based in Waterloo, Ontario, a city that is situated in the middle of what's known as the Haldimand Tract. This is a tract of land that extends for 6 miles on either side of the Grand River in southwestern Ontario. This land is located on the traditional territory of the Neutral or Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. This land was quote unquote given to the Six Nations of the Grand River as compensation for their role in the American War for Independence, during which these Indigenous nations fought for the British. Today, less than 5% of this treaty land is still under the administration of the Six Nations of the Grand River. I would like to just acknowledge on behalf of everyone at Aquanty our privilege and express gratitude for being able to live and work on this territory. Now, allow me to introduce today's speakers. First, we'll introduce you to Michael Williams. He's the head of restoration and client services at Ducks Unlimited Canada. Mike's a longtime employee with Ducks Unlimited Canada, beginning his career in Northern Alberta in 1990 as the area biologist for the Grand Prairie office, and remained there until 1997, when family and a warmer climate pushed him eastward. Since relocating to Barrie, Mike has worked in various roles designing and implementing wetland habitat programs at the landscape level. Since 2016, Mike has been managing Ducks' environmental consulting branch and is responsible for providing cost-effective nature-based solutions for their clients. And we also have Dr. Pascal Badiou, who has been a research scientist with Ducks Unlimited Canada Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research since 2006. Prior to joining Duck, Pascal worked as an aquatic scientist specializing in water quality and aquatic ecology for an environmental consulting firm in Winnipeg. In general, Pascal's research interests focus on the ecology of wetlands and shallow lakes. He's particularly interested in how multiple stressors such as drought, eutrophication, non-indigenous species, and pesticides interact to affect the ability of wetlands to enhance water quality and regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Currently, he's working on a number of prairie watersheds where he and his team are examining the impacts of wetland management practices on hydrology and water quality at large scales. He has a bachelor's in environmental science and a PhD in wetland ecology from the University of Manitoba. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Manitoba's Departments of Biological Sciences and Soil Science. Pascal, Michael, thank you very much for joining us today. I'll pass the mic over to you guys now.
Great. Thanks for that intro, Brayden, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are joining us today. Again, thanks for having us on this webinar. I will kick things off and then hand it over to Pascal later on in the presentation when we discuss the modeling in more detail. Let me just see if I can pull up my screen. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep, looks good, Michael.
Yeah, hang on a second. I need to get into presenter mode. Sorry, just bear with me here. Okay, I've got it. So again, thanks for having us today to talk about our project involving Ontario Power Generation and the partnership with Aquanty to look at the impacts or the hydrological impacts of wetlands and hydroelectric reservoir in Northern Ontario. So I will give a bit of a an introduction to Ducks Unlimited Canada for those of you who may not know the company. for those of you who don't know, a lot of our conservation programs in Ontario are focused in the southern part of the province where there's higher densities of wetlands or productive wetlands and higher densities of waterfowl. So that's typically why we focus our programs there, because that's where we're going to get our biggest return on investment. However, this particular project was of great interest to Ducks Unlimited because it was a real life scenario utilizing wetlands as a nature-based solution to help mitigate the impacts of climate change. And the results could help build a business case to restore and conserve wetlands in a geography where we don't typically deliver a wetland conservation program, because threats to wetlands up there are typically pretty low, and return on investment from a waterfowl perspective just isn't there. So if the business case does exist, then OPG and other power producers in other geographic regions will have another tool in their toolkit to increase the resilience of the landscapes where they operate against the impacts of climate change. So quick overview of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to give a brief intro to Ducks Unlimited first, and then get into the background of this particular project, talk about the different phases that we went through, including the lit review, the selection of the particular watershed we're working in, and as well as the model selection process. And then Pascal is going to take over to talk about the modeling results. So, a quick overview of Ducks Unlimited Canada for those of you who aren't aware of us or what we do. We are one of the most highly recognized conservation companies in Canada. Sound science drives our programs, and we are a private, not-for-profit organization whose mission is focused on wetlands and associated habitats, as their conservation benefits waterfowl, lots of wildlife, and of course, healthier communities. Wetlands, as you may know, are one of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet, but they provide a lot of other ecological goods and services, including surface water filtration, flood mitigation, carbon sequestration, and groundwater recharge, to name a few. And all of these contribute to healthier communities and climate resilient landscapes. And of course, the focus of this project is really going to be on the reduction of peak flows and improvement of base flows into a large hydroelectric reservoir. So that's going to be the focus of this particular project. Our company's been around since 1938, so this year marks our 85th anniversary. So we do have a lot of experience in designing and delivering landscape scale wetland programs. We can't achieve our mission alone, so we often work in partnership with many other conservation and government agencies, as well as private landowners. To date, we've got over 1,500 conservation projects across Ontario, involving about 2,000 private landowners. And last year, we surpassed our 1 millionth acre conserved, which is a huge milestone for us. So we do have a strong and relevant presence on the landscape, and we have a pretty big marketing communications team that gives us the ability to share stories and our research through various communication platforms. And we also do have our own science branch called the Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research, which is the branch that Pascal works for. Ducks Unlimited has been designing and delivering habitat projects for a long time, and our science helps us understand how and where to construct our projects to maximize return on investment and minimize long-term maintenance. We'd love to restore every trained integrated wetland out there, but we have limited resources, so we need to invest our contributors' dollars as strategically as possible. While we focus our conservation projects on sites that benefit waterfowl, we know that these projects also provide a lot of other benefits for other wildlife and society, as well as reduce the occurrence of invasive species. So getting into the background of the particular project interest today, Ontario Power Generation approached Ducks Unlimited Canada at a Dam Owners Advisory Committee meeting a couple of years ago, actually, to inquire about incorporating wetland restoration as a nature-based solution to mitigate the impacts of climate change on their large reservoirs. What they were noticing was a trend of lower midsummer water levels in the reservoirs due to having to dump water in the spring due to earlier and wetter springs that they've been noticing, and then not having enough recharge to handle the high or peak demand during the summer months when everyone had their air conditioner cranked. And incorporating green infrastructure like wetlands would help negate the requirement to either construct new natural gas power plants or purchase electricity from neighboring states or provinces. And both of those options are not really something that OPG wanted to pursue. So again, you see on the right-hand side a hydrograph from one of their Northern Ontario generating stations, where you see earlier wetter springs, which is a consistent trend across Ontario. So that means they're having to dump water. They can't store it. They can't overtop the dam. But at the same time, hotter, drier summers, so they can't recharge those reservoirs again in the summertime when there's a peak demand on electricity. So we certainly wanted to pursue this project with Ontario Power Generation, but the first step was to get a synthesis of all the research conducted on the hydrological impacts of wetlands in similar landscapes where OPG operates. So we undertook an extensive literature search, and the great news is that we found that wetlands can have an impact on peak flows and base flows. However, these impacts can vary significantly, both spatially and temporally, due to a variety of physical parameters. Therefore, modeling would be required to determine the site-specific impacts in a specific watershed. And for the modeling, it'd be critical to use the best available in situ watershed data to estimate the magnitude of those hydrological impacts on the watershed. Now, when it came to watershed site selection, OPG does own and operate roughly 66 hydroelectric generating dams in Ontario. And the key requirements here for this study were watershed size. We wanted something that was fairly sizable, that did generate quite a bit of electricity. And lots of wetland area, and that was another criteria, because if you're measuring the impacts of wetlands, you want to make sure that there are significant amount of wetland area in that watershed. And then the modeling is really only as good as the data you put into it. So we wanted to make sure that we had lots of good wetland data, and the site had to have at least 80% Canadian wetland inventory coverage, excuse me. So the watershed that we ended up selecting was the Dog Lake watershed in Northern Ontario, just upstream of Thunder Bay. It is a relatively intact, unimpacted landscape. There is a bit of forestry going on in the watershed, but other than that, it's fairly unimpacted. There are lots of wetlands in this particular watershed. For the modeling exercise, we had to select a specific lower threshold for wetland size. We couldn't run every single wetland through the model, or it would take weeks to run. So we selected a threshold of 1/4 square kilometer in size, and selecting that threshold still gave us about 60%, 66% of the wetland base that would be included in the modeling, which was equivalent to about 519 square kilometers of wetland area. So this was lots of wetlands, and that would allow us to assess baseline conditions as well as assess the impacts of increasing and decreasing the wetland area. So when going through the model selection process, we were considering timelines, cost, accuracy, and of course ended up going with Aquanty's HydroGeoSphere model because the sophisticated physics-based model is able to integrate both surface water and groundwater interaction and project how land cover changes can impact hydrological conditions. Not to mention, Ducks Unlimited had actually previously worked with Aquanty and this particular model on looking at the flood mitigation abilities of wetlands in certain watershed in southern Ontario, and had good results with that project. So after some discussion with Aquanty, we felt that we could successfully port this model to work in a boreal landscape to predict the hydrological impacts of wetlands as well as the future trends due to climate change. So with that, I will turn it over to Pascal now to talk about the modeling scenarios that we ran, as well as the results. So let me just stop sharing my screen here. There we go.
Pascal,
Can't hear you.
muted.
You're on mute.
Of course. Someone always has to do it at least once for every meeting. Okay. Anyways, hopefully you're seeing my slides and now hearing me. So as Michael and Braden mentioned, my name is Pascal Badiou. I'm a research scientist with Ducks Unlimited Canada's Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research. I've been working with the Institute for roughly 20 years, looking at wetland ecosystem services in general, focused on water quality, water quantity, carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas emissions, and really trying to understand how we can better manage, restore wetlands, conserve wetlands as nature-based solutions. Now, as Michael mentioned, for the last half of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the modeling results we obtained from the various scenarios that we examined using a HydroGeoSphere. Now, however, I want to start with this slide just to demonstrate some of the advanced functionality of the HydroGeoSphere model in terms of deploying computational nodes in areas of interest. So what you can see in this figure on the right-hand side is how we targeted nodes to focus on wetlands while minimizing the nodes in the more homogeneous upland landscapes. Now, while this is more efficient, it still results in a large number of computational nodes and therefore requires substantial computational resources to run this type of model. Okay, I think my slides are advancing now. Okay, so for our modeling work, we tested a few different scenarios. So the first consisted of examining a complete loss of wetlands in this watershed, which was really a sensitivity analysis to understand the magnitude and the role that wetlands play in the actual hydrology of this watershed. We also tested a second loss scenario, but at a much lower extent. So this consisted of looking at 25% wetland loss in a randomly distributed fashion across the watershed, as well as a distributed fashion, or a concentrated fashion. And then lastly, we looked at two wetland gain scenarios where wetland cover was increased in this watershed by 9% and 15% respectively. However, for this presentation, I'm only going to focus on the results from the 15% scenario, just to keep it manageable in terms of length. So again, for the first scenario, as I mentioned, we examined what would happen if all wetlands were removed from the landscape. So this involved converting all wetlands to barren land in the model and looking at the differences in peak flow and base flow conditions. And unsurprisingly, this scenario demonstrated a very large impact on overall watershed hydrology, resulting in a 60% increase in peak flows entering the Dog Lake Reservoir and a 60% decrease in base flows. Now, again, we realize that this is unrealistic, right? We're never going to lose 100% of the wetlands in this watershed. As I said, this was really just a sensitivity analysis, because if we ran this type of this type of scenario and didn't see any substantial change in hydrology, then it would have indicated that, there's probably no need to look at other scenarios and that this likely wasn't something that was going to be viable to explore. Now, on this slide, we're looking at the impacts of complete wetland loss on cumulative flow across the entire year for the period of 2010 to 2013. And what we can see is that in dry years like 2010, volumes are similar for the first half of the year, but in the summer months, we see that volumes are decreased substantially relative to the base case. And then conversely, in normal to wet years, we see that volumes are generally larger over the course of the year with respect to the base case scenario. Now, when we zoom in a little more on the issue and look specifically at water volumes, both in surface and subsurface conditions, we see that surface water volume is significantly decreased during dry periods for the 100% loss compared to the base case. And similarly, subsurface water volume is also significantly decreased for the 100% loss compared to the base case scenario. Now, again, this isn't surprising for this type of dramatic change. Again, this was really just to kind of put some ring boards on how we would expect the model to perform with respect to wetlands being manipulated in the model itself. Now, the next step was to look at more realistic wetland loss scenarios. So for this, we looked at two scenarios, one where wetland loss was evenly distributed, so taking 25% of the wetlands out of the watershed in a distributed fashion, and then a second scenario where we looked at more concentrated loss, where 25% of the wetlands were removed, mostly from the upper portion of the Dog Lake watershed, Dog Lake Reservoir watershed. And with respect to the results for these scenarios, what we see from this simulation is that it indicated that distributed loss resulted in a greater increase in peak flow relative to the focused loss, which was a little surprising and essentially had almost double the impact, whereas the impacts on base flow were similar across these two scenarios. So whether loss was distributed or focused didn't really seem to matter in terms of base flow. So again, some interesting results that we'll likely need to dig into to understand what's driving some of these differences or lack thereof. Now, one of the cool things that we did find through this work is these relationships between peak flow and base flow to wetland reduction. And so again, these are just two relationships that Omar put together from Aquanty, looking at the increase in peak flow relative to reduction in wetlands across that watershed. And so you can see that there's a fairly good relationship, that as wetland reduction increases or wetland loss increases, we see this correspondingly, fairly exponential increase in peak flow. Conversely, as we're losing wetlands, you can also see the decrease in base flow on the bottom panel here. Now, after we looked at these wetland loss scenarios, we wanted to examine, what would happen if we can re-inject wetlands on this landscape. So as I mentioned, we looked at two scenarios, increasing wetland cover by 9%, increasing wetland cover by 15%. I'm only going to present the results for the 15% increase here. And so again, we added roughly 15.4% of wetland cover back to the base case scenario. And at the Dog Lake outlet, this resulted essentially in a 3.7% decrease in peak flows, and conversely, a 3.4% increase in base flows. And so again, obviously not as significant as the results we're seeing from wetland loss, but again, these types of 3 to 4% increases and decreases actually have significant implications for hydroelectric generation. Now, the last piece of data I wanted to show here, and one of the other reasons why we decided to work with Aquanty and HydroGeoSphere, is the fact that HydroGeoSphere can integrate fairly sophisticated future climate scenarios using the weather research forecasting tool. And so, we worked with Stephen and his group to look at mid-century and end-century climate scenarios and how these impacted results for the 100% wetland reduction, as well as the 15% increase. And so, really the conclusion from this is that climate change is projected to impact hydrologic behavior in the Dog Lake Reservoir, with higher winter flow and earlier spring freshet and lower summer flow, which collectively is going to increase interseasonal variability. And so this wetland loss, is going to exacerbate the hydrologic effects from climate change, while increasing wetland coverage is shown to have a mitigating effect on reducing peak flows and, again, enhancing or sustaining base flows. And so, again, this is super interesting from a risk perspective when you start thinking about hydroelectric generating capacity moving forward. So we know that climate change is inserting risk into how these systems should be managed. And essentially, by having wetlands on the landscape or potentially increasing wetlands, we can show that you can manage that risk and essentially flatten these hydrographs to make sure that you're maximizing flow, the volume of water going to these generating stations. And so that really brings us to these next steps, where we're going to be working with OPG to calculate surplus electrical production resulting from increased base flow, as well as the volume of water that is now able to flow through generating station turbines during spring freshet that may have been spilt through emergency overflows in the past due to higher peak flows. And then Ducks Unlimited Canada is also going to be looking at program costs. So there's a few different things that we're considering in terms of wetland programs. Could we work with forestry companies around managing harvest road design to better conserve and potentially return some wetlands to the landscape, looking at other innovative solutions, potentially the deployment of beaver dam analogs to return beavers to landscapes where they perhaps have left due to historical land use change in portions of that watershed. And so this is going to be really interesting to start costing this out, what it's going to cost to potentially bring back and add wetlands to this landscape relative to the costs that OPG might be able to save by having additional capacity or managing risk in those generating stations with this type of nature-based infrastructure. And so with that, I think Michael and I are both happy to take questions regarding this research. I know Omar and Stephen from Aquanty are also on the line, so if there are some more technical questions regarding the model, we will likely bring them in as the ringers to address those. So again, thanks for attending and listening to this. We're really excited about this work. I think it's a really innovative look at how we can work with wetlands as a nature-based climate solution for managing some of the future risks associated with climate change.
Well, I'll just hop in quickly and thank you both, Michael and Pascal. It's always really great to kind of get an end use perspective on how people are using HydroGeoSphere. So thank you very much. And yeah, I guess we'll just open up the floor for questions. If anybody wants to raise their hand, or if you want to just put your questions in the chat, feel free. Looks like there's a question from Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Pascal. Thanks, Mike. Quick question. Canada's got all this fresh water, and we've got a lot of wetlands. And I sometimes wonder if we don't kind of take a lot of our resources for granted. Are there regions of the world that you're kind of aware of where water is more scarce and conservation efforts are more intense because of the scarcity, and maybe Canada has something to learn about approaches towards valuing wetlands?
So I can jump in here quickly. A few years ago, I had the good fortune of being part of a water experts panel from Manitoba that was doing an exchange with water experts from Israel. And so as a part of that group, we actually got to go visit Israel and how they're managing water. And conversely, they came here and looked at our scenario. Now, for those of you who don't know, Israel is essentially the size of Lake Winnipeg. So Lake Winnipeg in Manitoba is the size of that country. And they manage every drop of water very precisely. Nothing goes unused. So, now the difference there is they literally have one wetland, the Agmanahula wetland. So it's one large wetland, and they did everything they could in the past to drain it for malaria control perspectives. And now they're actually spending all these efforts to try and bring it back. But they intensively manage all of their water resources to the point where even their wastewater is essentially completely reused within agricultural systems. And so Steve, I think you're right. We take for granted a lot of the water that we have in Canada because there's an abundance of it. But I think that gives us, a false sense of security. And so, the Canadian prairies is a great example, right? 80% of the agricultural region of Canada, it is dotted with millions of small wetlands, that we have lost extensively over the course of history. And, we're starting to see these progressive impacts on water quality in all of the lakes across the prairies. And so, it's kind of highlighted within the Lake Winnipeg basin. So, that was named one of the sickest lakes in the world. And not surprisingly, we see, substantial land use change in that watershed with lots of the smaller, water resources like wetlands being impacted. And so I think historically we've frankly overlooked wetlands because we do have very large river systems, very large lakes, and we're an immense country. And so managing those water resources becomes challenging. And I think we've focused on those bigger systems. And I think we're only now realizing how important all of these other small water resources like wetlands, isolated wetlands on the landscape actually are for watershed health in general. Sorry, hopefully that addressed at least some of your questions, Steve.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that was good commentary.
Okay, I haven't seen any other questions coming up in the chat. We'll give it maybe another few seconds here, see if anybody raises their hands. There's another question here from Anna. Go ahead, Anna.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm interested in technical aspect. How did you include the additional wetlands into the model? How well did you use some kind of parameterization, and was it subsurface parameterization only or surface parameterization as well?
Yeah, so for a description of that, I think it probably makes sense to hand it over to Omar if he's willing to describe that process, because I know he actually spent quite a bit of time figuring out how to work within HydroGeoSphere to increase wetland cover by 9% and 15% for our scenarios. So I'm not sure if Omar or Steve want to tackle that.
Yes. Yeah, I'm here. So for adding wetland scenarios, we found out that the best way is to start from a smaller wetland and increase the size a bit. So you have the topography already there in the DEM. And for the surface domain, for this wetland, it will obstruct flow a bit. So we, in AGS, we have a couple of parameters that we use to contain water within a certain domain. One parameter will prevent water from horizontally moving outside the wetland, which is called rail storage. And we have another parameter that will restrict the water but not prevent it, which is called obstruction height. So we adjust both of these parameters. I think overall we have like a 40 centimeters of restricting water from moving, and plus we did some work also on the subsurface. So the soil layer will have more organic materials in it. And in combination, both of these parameters will work into adding numerically these wetlands into AGS.
Yeah, thanks for that, Omar. And that kind of points to our interest in potentially working with things like beaver dam analogs. And so, as Omar was saying, right, those adjustments kind of restricted flow. And so, similarly, that's done in a digital fashion in the model, but in the the real world, we could work with beaver dam analogs to try and implement that. And so it's we have to consider the types of wetlands in this landscape. And so again, it is mostly kind of these interconnected boreal peatlands where there's actually lots of opportunity to deploy these types of beaver dam analogs to increase wetland size in certain regions.
Okay, I do see one other very general question in the chat from Jillian about HGS and modeling inputs. I think I'll save that to the very end since it is such a broad question. I'll open the floor up again if there are any other questions for Michael or Pascal. Now's your chance. Here we go, Mathieu. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious how you guys got the subsurface information to code into your model and how you're, I guess, confident enough that that's good enough for your results.
Yeah, so I believe that will be a question for Steve, but perhaps Omar.
I could hop on quick. So that region of the Canadian Shield actually has fairly shallow depth to bedrock. So the bedrock surface is fairly well known just based on topography. And there has been some superficial geology mapping. So we have effectively thin quaternary hydrostratigraphy on top of a well-defined bedrock surface. And then the underlying Precambrian bedrock is fairly uniform. And it's been well studied in the context of deep nuclear waste repositories. So there's been work done up in that area looking at the stability of the underlying bedrock for storing nuclear waste long term. And because of that, the hydraulic properties of that bedrock material are fairly well defined, as well as the relationships between depth and things like permeability. So overall, that part of the Canadian Shield is fairly well characterized. And of course, we've got land cover data that's mapped at very high resolution, and the soils are reasonably well mapped. The bathymetry on some of the lakes is well defined. So in terms of what we're trying to do, there's actually a lot of available data to support the model construction.
Yeah, I guess my follow-up question would then be like, what would be the requirements if I were to want to do a similar study somewhere else? What is the kind of data that I need to look for to get to basically do something similar?
Yeah, I guess it really depends on where that somewhere else is. There's effectively now data sets that cover all of Canada for this type of modeling. Some areas have higher spatial fidelity than others, but in general, you could deploy that type of a solution anywhere in Canada. Local insights are very valuable, and what was really important for the Dog Lake work that was presented today was the actual the wetland inventory that Ducks Unlimited Canada brought to the table. Without the wetland inventory, we wouldn't have had the level of detail necessary to do some of the scenarios. So it was really important to have that wetland mapping to kind of help frame the scenarios that we simulated.
And Mathieu, I'll just hop in as well and shamelessly plug a project of ours called Canada One Water. So Steve alluded to the fact that we do have some national scale projects that provide all the data framework for this type of study across Canada. That project is called Canada One Water. We have an active website. Encourage you to look into that a little bit, or just reach out to me. I would be happy to meet and tell you a little bit more about it myself. I think I'll also just kind of segue into Jillian's question here about elaborating on the HGS software and modeling input. So just very, very briefly, HydroGeoSphere, as we know, is a fully integrated groundwater surface water model. In the the subsurface, we're using a 3D form of Richard's equation to model variably saturated groundwater flow, and in the surface domain, we're using the diffusive wave approximation of the Saint-Venant equation. Given that HydroGeoSphere is fully integrated, the models are quite data rich. You need to parameterize the subsurface with a lot of the data that you would expect from other groundwater models: porosity, hydraulic conductivity, specific storage. But as we are modeling variably saturated groundwater flow, we also need to build in some unsaturated flow relationships. We can either parameterize the Van Gnukten or the Brooks-Corey relationships, or we can simply specify pressure, saturation, and saturation to relative conductivity relationships via tabular values. In the surface domain, then we would also be, parameterizing land use type information, things like frictions coefficients, real storage heights, obstruction storage heights, and the like. We also incorporate evapotranspiration, potentially fracture flow, one-dimensional channels, and other features like that. So with each additional process, with each additional set of governing equations, we then have to parameterize those as well. So for evapotranspiration, which is extremely common, we would parameterize root depth, evaporation depth, and the relationship of root density and evaporation fluxes over those depths, things like that. So there's quite a lot of of input data that goes into these models. But as Steve said, there are projects out there that provide the entire data framework that allow you to kind of spin off these types of models anywhere across Canada. Outside of the footprint of the Canada One Water project, there's still data out there. Publicly available data is becoming easier and easier and easier to access year over year. It's just a matter of basically finding those sources. And so there are open access databases all across the world that have varying levels of fidelity, as Steve mentioned, or accuracy. But certainly just reach out to me if you're interested in kind of adapting HydroGeoSphere to your own projects. My whole job here at Aquanty is to sort of help people with the onboarding process and understand what kind of data is required and what the whole workflow looks like. We offer training sessions, free training sessions on the first Wednesday of every month. We can also put a temporary license in your hands, provide you with tutorials and example problems and that type of thing. So I hope that answers your question, Jillian, and also elaborates a little bit for you, Metzier. Once again, I'll open the floor if there are any follow-up questions. We'll just give it a few seconds here. Going once, going twice.
Well, while we're waiting for potential other questions, Braden, I just wanted to hop in here quickly after listening to your description. So these are some of the things that I've chatted about with both Stephen and Omar. And so it's really interesting because, accounting for wetlands in these models, requires understanding a lot of the parameters. And so you talked about evapotranspiration. And so this is where I think working with Aquanty is super exciting, because Ducks Unlimited Canada is now working on national scale wetland programs focused on understanding other wetland ecosystem services like carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas emissions. And to do that, we're deploying eddy covariance flux towers, right? So these are really sophisticated micrometeorology systems that are operating 24/7, 365 days a year. We have a few in the prairies. We are going to be installing another one in Quebec, but these are measuring wetland evapotranspiration in real time. And so one of the things I'm excited to do is, to work with Stephen to do some comparisons with kind of previous model-based kind of literature-based estimates, and to see, can we incorporate some of this data into HydroGeoSphere to make the model actually even better when incorporating wetlands, specifically in prairie landscapes where we have a lot of data coming in at the moment, but these wetland flux tower networks are evolving quickly, and I think Quebec is slated to deploy 8 in the next few years. So there's going to be massive amounts of data generated from potential test case wetlands that can then actually help better parameterize these systems in HydroGeoSphere.
Okay, I haven't seen any other hands go up or questions in the chat. So once again, Pascal, Michael, thank you both very much for taking the time out of your day to deliver this presentation. It was a really great use case for HydroGeoSphere, and again, yeah, just really appreciate you taking the time to deliver this presentation to our network.
Yeah, well, thanks again for having us. There actually is another project that wasn't mentioned that just started this year in the Washington Creek watershed in southern Ontario to look at the flood attenuation impacts of wetlands on the landscape. So maybe next year we'll have another presentation to deliver for you on that one.
That would be great. Okay, everyone, you've got 12 minutes back in your day. So thanks everyone for attending the webinar today, and hopefully we'll see you again in the new year.
Great. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye now.